Good morning and welcome back to the Morning Endurance Call. I'm Keith Erwood, and this is a free daily weekday leadership ritual for business owners, executives, and preparedness professionals who want to build stronger businesses, think more clearly under pressure, and lead with more clarity in uncertain times. Each weekday morning, we spend a few minutes talking about what it really takes to build stronger businesses, stronger leadership, and stronger preparedness in a world where disruption is part of reality. Today's topic is this: what leaders usually miss about critical functions. This matters because of the most common preparedness problems inside organizations is not that leaders ignore what is important. It is that they often confuse important with critical. And those are not always the same thing. Almost everything in business is important to someone. Sales is important. Operations is important. Finance is important. Customer service is important. Technology is important. HR is important. And compliance is important. But preparedness gets stronger only when leadership can answer a more precise question. What functions are truly critical to the business's ability to continue operating, protect value, and avoid unacceptable consequences? That is a different question. Because criticality is not just about whether something matters. It is about what happens if that function becomes unavailable. That is where leaders often miss the mark. They may define critical functions based on visibility, seniority, familiarity, politics, or historical importance, rather than business consequence. A function may be highly valued, highly visible, or heavily used, but that does not automatically mean it is the most critical from a continuity or recovery standpoint. On the other hand, a function that receives less daily attention may actually be far more critical if its disruption creates immediate financial, operational, customer, regulatory, or reputational harm. That is why criticality has to be defined through consequence, not preference. And that is the core idea for today. A function is not critical simply because it is important. It is critical because the business would face serious consequences if it were disrupted beyond an acceptable time frame. That is a much stronger standard. Now, why do leaders often get this wrong? One reason is that people tend to think in terms of organizational importance rather than disruption impact. They ask, is this valuable? Is this central to the business? Is this something we care about? Those are fair questions, but they are not enough for preparedness. Preparedness requires leaders to ask, what happens if this function goes away for 4 hours, for 1 day, for 3 days, or for a week? Who is affected? What stops? What gets delayed? What consequences begin to accumulate? What dependencies fail downstream? What financial or operational damage begins to grow? That is how criticality becomes clearer. Another reason leaders miss this is because different parts of the organization define critical differently. A department leader may say their work is critical because it is central to their team. Technology may define criticality based on system dependency. And finance may define based on revenue or cash flow. And operations may define it based on process flow. Compliance may define it based on regulatory exposure. And executives still may define it based on strategic importance. All of those perspectives can have value. But unless they are brought together through structured business analysis, the result is often inconsistent, inflated, or unclear definitions of what is actually critical. And that creates problems. Because if everything is called critical, then nothing is prioritized well. If everything must come back first, then recovery strategy becomes murky. If every team assumes its work is the top priority, then leadership has difficulty making disciplined trade-offs. If criticality is not tied to consequence, recovery efforts may be directed by internal pressures instead of business reality. And that is expensive. This is one of the reasons I often say one of the most valuable things preparedness work can do is help the organization define critical better. Not just faster, not just louder, better. So let's make this practical. What do leaders usually miss when they think about critical functions? First, they often miss the importance of time sensitivity. A function may be very important overall, but the business may be able to tolerate its disruption for a while. Another function may seem less prominent, but if it goes down for even a short period, the consequences may become serious very quickly. That matters. Criticality is not only about importance, it is about how quickly unacceptable consequences emerge. Second, leaders often miss downstream dependency effects. A function may look manageable on its own, but if several other processes depend on it, the real impact of disruption may be far greater than it appears. Sometimes the most critical function is not the one with the highest visibility. It is the one that quietly supports everything else. Third, leaders often miss the difference between strategic importance and recovery priority. Something may be strategically important to the business's long-term growth and success, but in the immediate aftermath of disruption, it may not need to be restored before more operationally urgent function. That distinction matters because recovery sequencing should reflect consequence and survivability, not just prestige. Fourth, leaders often miss the role of manual workarounds and temporary tolerances. A function may be important, but if the business has a credible workaround for a period of time, it may not be as immediately critical as assumed. By contrast, another function may have no workable backup at all, making it far more critical under disruptive conditions. And fifth, leaders often miss the value of asking, critical to what? Critical to daily convenience? Critical to customer delivery? Critical to revenue flow? Critical to life safety? Critical to legal or regulatory obligations? Critical to maintaining minimum viable operations? That question helps sharpen the conversation, because critical without context can become too broad to guide leadership decisions well. Now, this is where a strong business impact analysis becomes so valuable. The BIA helps organizations move beyond instinct and into structured consequence thinking. It helps clarify what functions matter most, how long disruption can be tolerated, what the consequences actually are, what dependencies exist, and what should actually be prioritized in recovery. Without that kind of discipline, criticality becomes too subjective. And when criticality is too subjective, leadership alignment gets weaker. That matters because in a disruption, clarity saves time. Clarity reduces friction. Clarity improves recovery. And clarity helps leaders make faster, better, more defensible decisions under pressure. And that connects directly to endurance. Because endurance in business is the ability to continue operating, make sound decisions, recover intelligently, and keep moving forward under pressure over time. A business strengthens endurance when it understands what is truly critical and prepares accordingly. If leadership does not define critical functions clearly, then resources may be misplaced, recovery priorities may be confused, and the business may lose momentum when it can least afford to. But when leadership defines criticality well, preparedness becomes more useful. Recovery strategy becomes more grounded. Testing becomes more relevant. Decision-making becomes more disciplined. And the organization becomes less fragile under pressure. That is the value. Now let me give you a practical way to think about this as a leader. Instead of asking, what in our business is important, try asking, what functions, if disrupted, would create unacceptable consequences within a specific time frame? That is a much better leadership question. You can go even further and ask, what would hurt first? What would hurt most? What would create the fastest operational consequence? What would create the biggest financial consequence? What would directly affect customers most? What would expose us legally or regulatorily? What would be hardest to work around? What would prevent us from maintaining minimum viable operations? Those questions help turn vague criticality into useful priority. And that is what leaders need. Because preparedness is not just about admiring complexity of the business. It is about understanding which parts of the business most need protection, continuity, and recovery attention. That is where real leadership value gets created. Now, I also want to say this for practitioners. If you work in continuity, IT disaster recovery, crisis management, or risk, one of your most important jobs is helping the business think more clearly about criticality. Not everything deserves the same label. Not everything can be restored first, and not everything has equal consequence. Your role is to help the organization distinguish what is essential from what is simply important. That is not always easy, but it is incredibly valuable. Because once criticality is defined, better, the rest of preparedness work improves. Plans improve, recovery strategies improve, testing improves, executive conversations improve, resource allocation improves. That is why this topic matters so much. So, here's today's leadership takeaway. Leaders often miss critical functions because they define criticality by importance, visibility, or assumption instead of business consequence and time sensitivity. That is the distinction. And here's today's question for you. Does your organization clearly know which functions are truly critical, or are you still relying on assumptions about what matters most? That question is worth thinking about carefully, because when disruption hits, the business will not be protected by vague importance. It will be protected by clear priorities. Thank you for joining me today on the Morning Endurance Call. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, join the free endurance community. That is where I'm sharing additional resources, tools, live learning, and ongoing conversation for business owners, executives, and practitioners who want to build stronger businesses through preparedness, leadership, and endurance. The link is in the description below. Tomorrow, I'll talk about why financial impact analysis matters more than many leaders realize, because consequence becomes much harder to ignore when it is translated into real terms. Until then, think clearly, prepare deliberately, lead with endurance. Thanks for joining. Bye now.